ending this from a March-April timeframe, meaning that we have to post the positions in March. By April, the association or the teachers can choose which 18 would like to volunteer. And those timelines have shifted from May and June, respectively. It also adds of our department chairs that we're teaching 4 classes will now be teaching the normal course load of 5 classes, 1 prep, 1 duty, and 1 lunch, as do the normal high school staff members. The third item is the duty coverage issues that take place. So there's an open grievance and arbitration that's taking place with result to some of the coverage language that existed in the prior contract. And the fact finder had agreed that we are going to defer the decision to this upon action taken after the arbitration. And the last item is we've added language where the parties will agree upon cooperating to maintain a health and safety and sanitary workplace. We do have elements in place that we do that now, but this putting it in the contract kind of memorializes the comments that we spoke about during the negotiation and allows us to move forward with some of the concerns that were shared at the bargaining table. With that being said, that's all that we have for the report on the fact finders.
Thank you, Mr. Bricker, and thank you, Mr. Regina. Are there any comments or questions by members of the board? Ms. Aubrey-Larsenis?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Regina and Mr. Bricker, for sharing that summary. I just wanted to say that while we did end up in fact-finding at the end of this negotiation, I wanted to commend our teams on both sides for the process that we followed. We did have substantial progress that had been made prior to COVID and prior to ending up in fact-finding. Many of the outstanding language issues, for example, were solved before we went into fact-finding. And I just wanted to take a minute to recognize our team, Paul Winters, Jen Cancro, Liz Drummond, and myself. The collaboration on our side, on their side, on both sides. I mean, we really, I have seen negotiations not go well, and I've seen them go well, and I definitely feel like this was a win in many ways, and I thank our team for the work that they put in.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Winters?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to point out 2 things that I think are real positives moving forward. Well, 3 actually. I do believe the salary schedule is very close to what we discussed a few years ago when we had the subcommittee related to the arbitration, non-binding arbitration that we had a few years ago that had been mentioned many times by the public, and sort of the direction we took and what is the final solution, I think is a real positive for maintaining and actually hopefully having a schedule that's appealing to individuals when they're seeking employment. Second thing I'll point out is I think there's been significant movement on what we need to do on the medical or prescription front, as it is a big driver for the district's costs, and the benefit of the Open Choice Plan 3 is hopefully something all the unions will consider more, and the idea is better off for the financial aspect of the district, but it also is actually advantageous for the actual employee on how much they're paying into their medical, and it's still a very good medical plan. So I encourage all the unions to consider that moving forward. And I also want to point out that one of the items that Mr. Regina mentioned about the 18 volunteers at the high school, and I think it is fair to say that this process has been, over the last 2 contracts, been very sticky issue between both the district and the union. But time and again, we've had volunteers beyond the time frame that has been requested, and there's been a lot of teachers that have, at the staff at the high school level, they're really trying to make sure that the programs that we're trying to facilitate with a very difficult schedule, as Dr. Sagini would attest, we've been able to make sure as many students are able to participate in as many learning experiences and things they want to experience in their high school schedule that can be very difficult. And it is truly appreciated that A lot of the MEA high school members have continued to step up beyond the contractual requirements of that. So hopefully these new dates that allow that will continue to allow the high school to have the outstanding programming that we have. So, thank you.
Good comments, Mr. Winters. Thank you very much. Other questions or comments from members of the board? Seeing no others, again, Mr. Bricker and Mr. Regina, you guys partnered with the board as part of that negotiation process, and certainly, we want to echo what our president has said. It was a great effort on both sides, and while it took more time than one would hope, we hope that this provides a good working environment for us to move forward and do some great things for our students and our community. So thank you to everyone that was involved.
Yes, I'm sorry, Tim and Che. I thank you as well for your participation in all of this. We really could not have done it without you.
No problem, Kim. Well done yourself. You guys did a wonderful job. Thanks.
Glad to help.
And so, Madam President, that ends the presentations for this evening.
Okay, Mr. Summers.
President, yes, just before going into reports, I'd just like to expand upon the executive session report from earlier this evening and just clarify that executive session on February 18th was for the purpose of the board consulting with his attorney regarding information and strategy in connection with the litigation in the Montgomery County Court of Common Pleas between the Methacton School District and the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records. And those cases are docketed at numbers 2020 05045, 17454, 20101, 20878, and 2021 01133. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. Okay, with that, we will move on to our report. Questions as we get to those action items. We ask that you keep your comments to 4 minutes or less, and if you could state your name and municipality before you begin speaking. So those that pre-registered to speak tonight, if you could raise your hand and I will bring people in. Okay, first I have Jessica Bradbury.
Hey, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Jessica Bradbury, Lower Providence Township. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to go through and write down which specific agenda items, but I think it should be obvious. So first, regarding the return to school for 7 to 12, I hope to see the board approve that agenda item this evening. Nearly a year after our last in-person board meeting, I would respectfully ask the board to revisit the suspension of board policy 006.2, specifically regarding the limitation on the number of school directors participating in a meeting electronically. Members of this community would like to see the board lead by example. Our teachers and children have returned for in-person learning while supporting remote participants, and yet the board meetings continue to be in an all-virtual mode. What is the reason for this? As I mentioned last week, facial expressions and body language are a huge part of communication. We should have the ability to meet in person while still maintaining the option for virtual participation indefinitely. With regards to the Eagleville renovation and addition, we heard last week from KCBA that the canopy was added relatively late in the project and there's no real benefit. So I'm just wondering who had requested that to be added into the scope and why. What other options were explored to remediate the security issues? Were there any other options submitted by KCBA or any other architects at any other price points? Or are we essentially looking at one proposal from one architect with likely the most expensive option? The more the project costs, the more KCBA stands to profit. Shouldn't we also have the board first approve full-day kindergarten, the creation of that program, before we approve 2 additional classrooms to be built for it? As members of the public, we're watching more and more building expenditures being approved by the school board without evaluation for 4 alternatives to ensure fiscal responsibility. We've operated at a surplus for many years now, and yet rather than return some of this year's $5 million surplus to the taxpayers, instead we're talking on a tax increase. During this past year, while many small businesses, large corporations, and even our very own households have reevaluated our budgets, cutting expenses wherever we can due to the uncertainty caused by the pandemic, I'm just wondering, has Methacton School District Administration and our board directors taken that same view of our budget to determine if maybe we can cut costs rather than increasing revenue through tax raises? That's it. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Okay, next I have Joe Rittenhouse.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Joe Rittenhouse, Lower Providence Township. I just want to keep it short. I wanted to speak in favor of the motion to go back to school. It seemed very positive. It seemed like most of the board was on board last time, so I wanted to continue to make sure that vocal support was heard from the community. I'm actually really, really happy that Dr. Zerbe spoke up about a future plan going forward, not for the coming year and stuff like that. So I guess my only question is, when it comes to this current plan and how it will phase into a potential other plan, is what will the benchmarks be for lowering the distances between students? What will the benchmarks be for how much we go back to school? When will we look for non-masking, if possible? Are we going off of Montgomery County? Are we going off of Pennsylvania? I just want to have a very detailed list of every step and what benchmarks we will hit, so that everyone knows exactly what we're going into, and there's no two week delays for everything else. Outside of that, I think it's a great plan. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rittenhouse. Next I have Greg Young.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great, Greg Young, Worcester. Just to pile on to what Joe was saying, I'm feeling pretty good that we're heading in the right direction. Confident in tonight's vote, based on last week's work sessions, that we're going to be voting to go back 7 through 12, 4 days a week. What I'd like to see, not just input from the staff regarding next year's school year and what the plan should be, with 6 feet reduced, maintaining masking, etc., that we should be focusing primarily on 5 days, no virtual option, or what I'll call a virtual crutch. We definitely don't want to consider a 4-day plus a virtual day as the new normal. Other than that, I think the metrics are good for K through 6, 64% in person, and I am excited to hear that there's a 2-year plan being developed for the whole child, because that's where we should be focusing our time and energy, is on the children. Thank you.
Thank you. Next I have John Andrews. Whenever you're ready. Yes, I can.
John Andrews, Lower Providence. I'd like to compliment the 3 pitches early in today's meeting. They were very well done and informative. I was disappointed that the list of bills has an item for niche.com, a boost program for about $6,000. We've been in the mode of good education rather than paying for good stories, and that's it's unfortunate that we're going in that direction. Relative to use of surpluses, huge surpluses, I read in the newspapers of effects of the pandemic in the United States, either 10 million or 20 million people out of work. Locally, we're supporting a lot of food program through as Aramak described, and I think some surplus should be returned to the taxpayers. And with regard to the blended instruction option, it's starting on March 15th. I wished it could have started sooner. That's all I have this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Next I have Brian Earnshaw.
Good evening, Brian Earnshaw, Lower Providence. First comment relates to item 8, suspension of board policy. I also have a question about when in-person meetings will resume. And if it's to be determined, what parameters are you looking for to resume those meetings in person? That's not only the board, but the committee meetings as well. Next is item 10A, the list of bills. November legal fees paid to Sweet, Stevens, Cass, and Williams are about approximately $145,000. Whether you can provide any commentary on what matters that related to, whether that's a recurring monthly expense that we should expect, and what steps, if any, are being taken to reduce those legal fees. On the treasurer's report, there's still $6.5 million of taxes held in escrow, I believe all of which relates to the Shannondale tax bill litigation, where the board at some point in the near future could provide an update of that litigation. Item 10D, the depository approval. Based on review of the Finance Committee meetings, I believe this approval should be retroactive. The minutes stated that, when I read, that this account has already been opened and there are taxpayer funds deposited into this account. Regarding item 10I, committed fund recommendations, I'm concerned the way that, basically this is just done to solve being done to solve budget issues. And it can be viewed as a budget gimmick as opposed to really addressing the operational issues that may be contained in the budget. Last year, the board hastily committed $2.6 million of surplus to PESER's funds, to a PESER's reserve, which never materialized. And now, instead of returning that money to taxpayers, the board or the administration has found another use for those funds by paying down debt. And regarding that debt, I'll ask for the third time, what is the interest rate on the debt being retired? If those rates are extremely low, it does not make any sense to retire that debt. Regarding the commitment of funds for charter school expenses, I think it's inappropriate to use surpluses to offset operating costs. There is an assumption, which is again speculative, that those charter school costs will come down, that students will in fact return to Methacton. That's kind of speculation similar to the PESER's set aside that was done last year. So I would encourage the board to vote against both items in 10I, and vote to return funds to taxpayers, those surpluses, at least some portion, if not all of them. And if the board doesn't want to do that, I'd like to hear from each of the 9 board members why you feel that a tax and spend policy is more appropriate than returning funds to taxpayers. Regarding item 10J, this project, Eagleville renovations, has morphed into addressing water infiltration and insect infiltration issues to include an expansion. $2 million of the $6.7 million total cost is going to expand the building, adding classrooms when the district already has excess capacity in its buildings. It was cited that KCBA said to add classrooms later would cost $4 million. But remember, KCB's estimate on Arrowhead was way off, to the tune of about 25%. They overstated it, so I'm not relying on their estimates. You should get another estimate to confirm that cost. So the board, I would encourage to vote against this project, or at least take the $2 million out for the expansion. It's been stated that additional classrooms are being built for full-day kindergarten, which is a program that has not been approved by the board. Let's see. Regarding item 11L3, which is retroactively approving a supplemental contract for bus duty, my question there is that amount prorated for the 4 days that students are in the buildings, and for the days that the students are in the buildings for the second semester of this year. I believe that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next I have Lucy Bove. You can unmute whenever you're ready.
Hello, Lucy Bove, Lower Providence. I wanted to continue to advocate for the 7th through 12th grade students. And I guess my question is, why isn't there any urgency? Why are we waiting from one meeting to the next to address this and vote on this? Our children are in crisis. These students need to get back full time. Also curious, why are we looking at 4 days and not 5? I believe they should have the option of going to school. We are here to educate them, everyone there. Without students, no one has a job. We don't need teachers, we don't need staff. So I'm asking, please, make it urgent and think about the students first. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, is there anyone else that has registered to speak? Seeing none, we will move on with our agenda. We have a motion to approve it for our voting items this evening. We have our dates for our board members' calendars with the meetings coming up in March. And does anyone have any old business this evening? Reese?
I don't know if it's old, but I think we addressed maybe not every single, I think we addressed most questions that were brought up. There was a question about some legal bills, and I believe, is finance going to be having some discussion about that next month? Is that correct or not correct?
We have not set the agenda yet, but I will be speaking with the chairperson on those matters, yes.
Okay, so if they're not discussed at finance for some reason, we will make sure to discuss it at the board meeting, because it is an area of concern.
Anything else for old business? How about new business? Ms. Purdue?
This may fall under old business, but I was wondering, I know Dr. Zerby mentioned when they talked about niche.com, as far as what we're doing is actually looking into it for lessons and or to look at how they gather their information. I'm wondering if that's something that he will be, once we get the information that's needed, to share with the board and the community also.
Yeah, actually, Ms. Purdue, I'm glad you shared that, because as part of my presentation for April, I will be sharing that information, absolutely.
Thank you.
Great, anything else under new business? Okay, with that, we will move to courtesy of the floor. The board of directors required members of the public wanting to make comments to pre-register by 5 p.m. today. This is an opportunity for residents to provide comments on matters that could come before the board. We ask that you keep your comments to 4 minutes or less. The board may choose to respond to matters following the conclusion of the courtesy of the floor period. And as always, if you could just start by stating your name and municipality. Okay, first I have Lauren Nelson.
Hi, Lauren Nalgin, Worcester. I just wanted to mention 2 things. Number one, obviously we are at Worcester and have an interim principal, and I just wanted to acknowledge Mr. Feely. He has been so communicative, and the dismissal process of arriving and leaving, it's been smoother. We have been in the district 3 years, and the Worcester parking lot, I remember vividly when we first, attended school, it's dangerous. And the fact that there is now traffic directing, that's huge. And I hope, and I missed there was a lot of information tonight on the budget, but I hope that there will be something in place permanently for the traffic flow. 73, very dangerous. So I hope that's considered, and it's not just a temporary measure. Because even on a normal non-COVID year, the traffic in that parking lot is very high and dangerous. So thank you to him for all he has done in his very short time with us so far. And the second thing I just wanted to mention, surrounding districts, and I know we're not comparing, but they have offered 5 days a week. And I'll be honest, as a working parent with 5 children, the 5th day is disruptive. I felt badly. My son came home and said, "Mom, I forgot my whiteboard. I forgot this." And, I forgot. It's a lot to send them 4 days, which I'm very appreciative of. and have that fifth day where they unload everything. You know, the teachers are doing everything to do the virtual environment and then pack it all up and leave on Monday. Things are going to get missed, and it is disruptive. And I know that 4 days is great, but I don't see why we can't have a plan to go back for that fifth day. Again, there's so many parents that don't have childcare and are working, and it's challenging. And it's not a daycare babysitter situation. It's just that continuing. There are virtual students that remain consistently. That's their choice. But for the 4 days, I just don't see why we can't offer that fifth day. And it doesn't sound like that's even going to be an option for the remainder of the school year. So hopefully that can be reconsidered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Najee. Next I have John Andrews.
John Andrews, Lower Providence. I want to bring up an item relative to today's agenda that I missed earlier, and that is that on the committing funds for charter school expenses, the sentence reads 1.0 commit $603,000 from the anticipated 2021 surplus to charter school expenses. There's no period at the end, and I'm wondering, is that for charter school expenses for this fiscal year or next fiscal year, or both? That's a question to be hopefully to be answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Next I have Joe Rittenhouse.
Hi, Joe Rittenhouse, Lower Providence. I'm going to keep it brief, but I thankful for the back to school for the 4 day. But again, as the earlier speaker spoke about, I wanted to reiterate, I think that there needs to be a plan in place for that fifth day. And I worry that we are setting ourselves up for going to the end of the year without any consideration for what that fifth day might look like, or what not might look like, and what the following year will be. I worry that we will go into the next year again with another 4 day solution and not a 5 day. Secondly, I just want to talk about transparency for a little bit. I feel like maybe it's just the people I speak to in relation to the board meetings, but there's a lot of a rhetorical trick called Gish Gallop going on, where a lot is thrown at people very much, and it's hard for them to keep track of every single situation that's going on, and sometimes votes can get past them, which they were unsure about. Looking at transparency, sometimes the requests that I've put in and others have put in, they aren't fulfilled, even though a lot of the stuff that we've gotten back was public information, but it's still censored. So I just kind of wanted to ask, like, what is the criteria for stuff that isn't obviously legally required to be censored? Why some stuff that is public information is censored? Third, I want to thank Zerby, Purdue, and Cancro for speaking about niche.com for the bit that's come up. I'm still confused a little bit about it, because as I'm looking at the site as it speaks, as it sits right now, we are the only verified account on there that has multiple avenues for, prospective, I guess, people moving into the district to look at. So I just want to understand, do we pay for that? Is that something we pay as a district to have? Because the ranking on here is not commensurate to what it is for the rest of Pennsylvania. And it is, I don't want to, it's not the exact same number. And I think that I would just love more information. I'm not suggesting anything outside of that. And then finally, I very briefly wanted to talk on the DEI committee. I had the pleasure of taking a class with the DEI committee that I believe was formed prior to the committee associated with Methacton. I am a little confused as to what that distinction is between those two committees. I know one is probably private and the other one is through the school, but they share very similar names, and I'm a little bit confused as to what, how they work together. I wanted to ask about the volunteers. So part of the concept of equity is the idea of equal treatment, not as opposed to equality or equal treatment under the law. I wanted to understand the 30 volunteers that would be asked on what is the criteria for those 30 volunteers? How many BIPOC students, teachers, faculty, social demographics? I took a wonderful class with the local group, and they brought up ethnicity, age, indigenous status, body size, class, social class, religion, faith, race, health, sexual orientation, gender, national origin, and disability / ability. I just think that it should absolutely be public information what the DEI task force is, who is accommodated. I want to make sure that we're not leaving people out. I also want to make sure that the group in and of itself is genuinely searching for equity. So yeah, I just wanted to understand if we could get an idea from Zerby or anyone on the board what that criteria for the volunteers would be, and if they're looking to expand that to fit criteria that they do not reach. If, say, they don't fulfill a social class or health status, what that would look like. Outside of that, thank you.
Next, I have Greg Young.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Greg Young, Worcester. Thank you for the vote tonight to go back to 7th to 12, 4 days a week with 1 day virtual. Certainly with a focus, hopefully the focus is on getting back to a 5 day, not to sound like a broken record, but that 5th day virtual just feels like, in personal opinion, like a crutch. And I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, and Ms. Larsenese, you said the reason for the 2 modalities and the virtual option is so we could bounce back and forth. We need to be clear that we're focused on a plan to go back 5 days a week next year. I have very little confidence that any of that planning or discussions is in play for this year. But just hearing that, the reason why we have 2 modalities is because we're in a pandemic. Well, the pandemic's not going to be going away in September, but we can put a health and safety plan in place that can give us 5 days a week without having the 4+1. As you heard another parent say tonight, that virtual day is disruptive. I'm sure it's disruptive for hundreds, if not thousands of people. And then Mr. McGinnis, when he said that we moved the goalpost, I don't think we moved the goalpost. I think that survey that came out that polled the parents or polled the community about a 2-day hybrid, that was a misfire of a survey. That survey should have never even gone out. It should have been a 4+1 virtual poll. That the parents were confused as to why that survey was even going out. That's water under the bridge. Now we're with 4+1. Let's move forward. Focus on the 5 day a week. Just one comment about the fact finding, and maybe I'm confused and it can be clarified later. But when I look at the bullet points that led to fact finding, I'm questioning whether or not fact finding was even necessary. We're talking about, health and safety language that found its way into fact finding, safe, health, sanitary procedures. If there was pushback on that, then I'm scratching my head. I understand the 4-year agreement, that may have been something that needed some fact finding, but a 1% increase on medical and dental costs, the average is, I'd say 4, 5, 6% per year. That 1% increase in the contract is going to result in more and more negative impact to a yearly budget. But I'll look into those budget discussions as I can get to them. But other than that, feeling very positive about the vote tonight. Thank you very much. Let's just move forward together.
Thank you. Next, I have Jessica Bradbury.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Jessica Bradbury, Lower Providence Township. I'd like to start with the motion to suspend Board Policy 006.2, approve 9-0, with absolutely no commentary from the board. Could you please tell the public why you will not even discuss returning to in-person board meetings? Also earlier, was everyone with their hand raised permitted to speak? and not the strangers from Pittsburgh that we're afraid of, but people in the community that participate often. Is that why we prefer the virtual arrangement? Because it allows better control and censorship? Second, the teacher's contract. Has this been signed? I know the fact finder's report was approved. We talked about it earlier tonight, leading most of us to think the issue was settled. However, I've spoken to some teachers and I'm hearing that is not the case. So please tell us what's the reason for the delay and when can we expect the teachers to have a valid contract in place? Why does it take so long for the board meeting minutes to be posted? Why aren't all the presentations that are given on our Zoom calls during committee meetings, work sessions, and regular meetings posted on the website for the public to review? When we want to review these presentations, you are forcing us to submit a right to know request. As one of the callers earlier mentioned, when we do get our request fulfilled, we're given a presentation that we saw live during a committee meeting, where every single slide is blacked out. These documents are viewed publicly, therefore they are public record. We're talking about the return to school slide. There's nothing sensitive in that. So providing a document that is comprised entirely of redacted pages is only furthering our issues with transparency, not to mention driving up the exorbitant legal fees. Just to reinforce what others said earlier, we must, no questions asked, must restore a 5-day in-person learning model for next year. The 5th virtual day is disruptive to everyone, to the children, to the teachers, to the parents. The only way to move forward is through strong leadership and proactive planning. Why would we wait 2 more months to begin those discussions in May? The children in our communities are our greatest assets and our most precious treasures. Our number one priority should be planning for their future and discussing their return to the classroom 5 days per week, as soon as possible. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you. Brian Earnshaw.
Brian Earnshaw, Lower Providence. First, thank you to Mr. Winters and Ms. Reese for addressing some of the comments and questions I had during public comment on board action items. Not all items I brought up were addressed. So my first question is, how is the decision made about who is going to answer what and what questions will or will not be answered? I know the board president said your time is valuable, but ours is as well. So it just feels like, I'm wasting my time. But if you could just tell me how you decide on what you're going to respond to or not. The items that weren't responded to was, as the previous commenter mentioned, was the resumption of in-person board meetings. I'd still like to hear what the criteria is for when that will happen. If it will never happen, just tell us. Tell us what you're looking for before you will resume in-person meetings. I appreciate looking into the legal fees, but the legal fees I was referred to were incurred in November, and there should be some sort of understanding what those were for, given that it was $145,000, essentially enough to fund 2 teachers' salaries and benefits for an entire year. It should have an understanding of what those are for, and nobody's able to answer that question for some reason. We'd like to hear about Shenandoah, where that stands. That's been going on for 10 years or more. And $6.5 million of taxpayer funds are sitting there. You've had to take a higher tax increase because of that money held in escrow. It sounds like that new depository account, I don't know if it was retroactive or not, but it was implemented before board approval. There was no indication whether it was retroactive or not. And then there was some discussion about looking at financing involving PFM. I would encourage the board to take a look at a recent Philadelphia Inquirer article about what PFM's recommendations and their impact of interest rate swaps had on certain school districts and a hospital before you engage PFM, as far as looking for their recommendations on what to do with that. Because they also stand to benefit on any refinancings that are done. They're going to get fees for doing that. And lastly, I find it, on the debt that you're paying off, I find it incredible that nobody on the finance committee or the board had looked into what those interest rates were. And the fact that on one of the debts being retired, Mr. Bricker still doesn't know what the interest rate is. When you retire a debt, it's a common analysis to do to look at what the interest rate is and what makes sense for an efficient use of capital standpoint. It's just incredible that nobody looked into that. And the fact that you're taking surpluses that were set aside for PSERs and then just use it to pay off debt without any sort of analysis being done just says to me that you're just looking for a home for that surplus cash and do anything with it except return it to taxpayers. It just doesn't make any sense. And there's got to be some sort of financial analysis done to assure taxpayers that you're using their money, their funds, in the most efficient way possible. Because if you're not doing the analysis, you're not. I just don't get it. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, I have Michael Ryan.
Good evening, everyone. Michael Ryan, Lower Providence. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. I just wanted to make some comments about the how happy I am that the district and MEA came to an agreement on the fact finders report. I know Mr. Bricker had made some comments about the salary schedule revisions, and Mr. Winters had made some comments as well, but this is just such an important thing for the district, and I hope that everyone out there realizes that this part is good for both sides here. From the district standpoint, this is phenomenal for budgeting. It's also great, as Mr. Winters mentioned, for retention, especially for the younger teachers. If they're sitting there at step 2 or step 3 when they get hired, and 4 years later they're only sitting at step 7 if they're lucky, and they're not making a whole lot of money. So what do you do if you're stuck in that situation? And we've seen it. Teachers will look to make more money in a neighboring district. The revisions that take place over these next 4 years hopefully will stop that from happening, which will be great for teacher retention. And the new starting salaries, I think, are going to be fantastic as well. The teacher marketplace is so tough right now. So having these competitive salaries will help bring in better teachers to Methacton. So from the teacher standpoint, they're sitting there now where they can make a reasonable percentage increase every year, which is phenomenal. They don't have to wait until step 11 when they can finally get a jump, or the big jumps that came thereafter. So I remember years ago fighting for this, and unfortunately it didn't happen during my time on the Methacton School Board, but I am very happy to see that it did now. And in fact, when I first joined this board and had discussions with fellow board members back then, the discussion was, don't even try it. It's too hard. It's too expensive. It will never happen. And I just want to commend this board for putting in the time, the effort, and all the long hours that it took to get to this point. This is a great thing for Methacton, so thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. All right. Seeing no one else then for courtesy of the floor, I will close that portion of the meeting and let's move on. Are there any items, anything else that the board wishes to address before we adjourn? Mr. Winters?
So I want to make sure I say this correctly. I am not cherry picking off. I'm trying to answer as many questions as I can. There was a question related to the charter school expenses. They are related to next year's based on an expectation of a certain number of students continuing on charter schools that would not be the traditional amount of students going to charter schools. If somebody else wants to put more language around that, that's please. There was questions related to, I think we should discuss the in-person. I think Ms. Larson-East has discussed this before. I do agree the principle that some of the presentations should be, we need to do a better job from an organizational perspective of putting those presentations more timely on the agendas and so forth, especially for presentations that have been made. For the aspects related to some of the questions about the contract, the 1% increase in the medical is an increase for the employee to pay. So when they're paying 17%, they're paying 17% of the premium share. When they go to 18% the following year, they're paying 1% more of the total premium share. often that doesn't even cover the cost, the increasing costs that happen to the medical. So just for a clarification, or maybe I misunderstood, I apologize. But that the principle of trying to go avoiding fact finding, we all wanted to avoid fact finding. You get to a certain point where you're not coming to an agreement. So there were many issues on the element related to all the elements that were discussed by Che and Tim, but we did settle a lot of them, and some of them we needed somebody else to help settle some of that information for us. Ideally, we would settle without having a third party. So hopefully in 4 years, whoever's on the board can do that. Legal fees. There is a lot of legal fees. I think we discussed in summary some of those legal fees. I believe I mentioned some of the major aspects, which leads into the Shenandoah conversation. Shenandoah is on schedule for a court case at the end of March. Obviously, we're not going to talk anymore related to the court case, but certainly there's many on this board that would love to see resolution to that issue. And I think that's it. If somebody wants to jump in, please do.
Mr. Navarrete?
Yeah, I gotta let Paul go first all the time because he takes all the answers. It's great. Just one question. There's a question raised about DEI, and I sat through that same class that the person in the public referenced. It was incredible. But I think it's important to note that there are two different and distinct groups and organizations here. The DEI task force is a local nonprofit entity that operates privately. Certainly many of us are involved in it and care deeply about this issue. The effort that's being undertaken by the school district has certainly been inspired by the efforts by that DEI task force, and is certainly an outcropping of the concerns that have been raised by the DEI task force. But they are separate. They are different entities. And I think that should be made clear. But I do expect, just like there were policy considerations that were made to the code of conduct based on the concerns that were brought up by that group, they're another stakeholder within our community, just like parent groups, sporting groups, home and school associations, and like any group, we'll work with them to achieve the goals that we all want for our kids.
Thank you, Mr. Navarrete, for clarifying that.
Have a comment just while we're talking about the DEI, and I was going to ask maybe if Dr. Zerby can speak to the different subgroups that will participate, just because I think that was one of the questions asked about what the volunteers will look like, who will be part of that group. And I know just from the work that Dr. Campbell is doing, we'll have different subgroups that will participate. We'll have students, we'll have parents, we'll have community members, teachers and staff. So I don't know, Dr. Zerby, if you want to add on to that a little bit more.
Certainly, Ms. Perdue and Ms. Kelly, I think we've included the presentation that outlined how those groups would be constructed, and we've also have the video available for the meeting, the DEI kickoff meeting that where Dr. Campbell explained that process. So in more detail, that stuff is available on the district website. If you go to the main website under departments and find the Department of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, all the information is there for you. But just in general, there is a group of, I believe, 6 employees within the district, 2 being administrators, the other 4 teachers within the district that are considered the leadership team, and that have been working directly with Dr. Campbell as part of the district's efforts. And they will be reviewing the 85 applications that I said earlier were submitted. And there are, I believe, 5 subgroups, which will have about 6 individuals for each subgroup, which gets us about the 30 individuals for that group. So they are looking at a number of things in terms of of the application process has some questions. Those questions will be used to make the best cross-section representation for our district. And of course, there are things that they're considering as the presentation for that evening outlines. There's a number of different things. It's just not race, religion, those types of things. I think there's probably like 40 or 50 different indicators with which we're looking at in terms of lenses to look through as we start having these conversations. So I think it's all laid out there. If any member of the public has any other specific questions, they can certainly email the Ms. Kelly. What is the email address?
It is DEI@methacton.org.
Excellent, thank you. So and there's that's constantly monitored, and any information or suggestions that anyone from the community has will certainly that gets pushed on to the district leadership team, and Dr. Campbell gets access to that, and we use that information as part of our process going forward. So I hope that Ms. Perdue answers some of those questions.
And if I can just also add to that, that the number of 30 participants in this group was something that was suggested by Dr. Campbell as a manageable size, that's where work can get done and things can get accomplished, but it's not